Alrighty. Well, the wind is howling out there, but it's not bad in here. It's comfortable at least in here, which it isn't always, but it is at the moment. Rocky is fast asleep in his box. Well, he was fast asleep until I disturbed him. There he is in his box anyway with his fish. Hey you. And his towel with the hot water thing in it that's now cooled off. Of course, it's no longer putting out the heat. But anyway, I'm going to tell you a story now, something that I was just thinking about. I was on a messenger chat on Facebook Messenger with a friend, and I just thought of this because of that chat. Um, when I was growing up, of course, I'm 56 years old now. I'll be 57 this year. So I grew up in a different era. I grew up in an era where violence was often used to solve problems, to solve conflicts between people, and so on. It was a lot more common back then than it is now. And of course, when you were a child in that era, you were raised, for the most part, on the back of the hand and the toe of the boot. I mean, you screwed up, you got beat. That's how it was. So I say all that just to say that my childhood wasn't unusual. I remember hearing my friends getting beat in their homes at night. Sometimes if I walked along through where I lived, I would hear that. I remember having friends' fathers come out and pick them right up by the hair off their feet and just literally open the door and throw them inside, and then you'd hear them taking a beating and stuff because they'd done something that they shouldn't have done and so on. That was just kind of how it was back then. But saying all that, my dad, he used to beat me. He used to take his fist to me. He used to knock me across rooms. I knocked me unconscious more than once. I was scared of my dad. I think most of us were scared of our dads back then. Really, I don't think that was unusual. But anyway, the thing is, though, my dad, he passed away at 51 years of age in September of 1988. I was his only son that survived. There was one little boy that died a few hours after he was born, but I was the only one that survived anyway of the sons. He had a few daughters, but only the one son, and I was named after him. His name was Tom, and my name's Tom. Anyway, in July of 1988, my dad came to see me. Now, he never told me he was dying. I knew he was dying. Our grandmother, my dad's mom, was dying. And I remember being at the house, at my grandparents' house one time. We were all standing out on the back stoop, me and a bunch of the other grandchildren and different relations. And they were talking about how awful it was, what was happening with Grandma and stuff, and how she wasn't going to be with us much longer. She was in her bed inside the house there, quite sick, and she was dying. She was full of cancer, and she was suffering terribly, and she was dying. And anyway, my dad, he came out of the house. He just nodded on his way out, went and got in his car and left. And I said to the others there, I said, well, get ready because there's going to be 2 funerals this year. And they all just kind of stopped and looked at me like they would sometimes. I tend to say things that kind of make people wonder, but they said, what do you mean? I said, well, Dad, I said, he's going to be gone too, soon. I said, I don't think he's going to make it through the year. Oh, that's crazy. He'll outlive us all, that guy. What are you talking about? I said, well, I'm telling you, he won't. I said, I can tell just to look at him. I said, he's on his way out too. Anyway, I was right. He died 2 weeks after my grandmother passed away. I think he hung on as long as he did in order that she wouldn't have to deal with him dying when she was dying herself. But anyway, Bottom line was, my dad was also on his way out. And, but like I say, he was full of cancer too. But he never told anybody anyway. He kept it to himself. And, but the bottom line is, he came to see me. Now, like I say, I knew he was dying, but he didn't know that I knew he was dying, or at least if he did know, he never said. And he certainly never told me he was dying. He didn't tell anybody, really. And so, anyway, when he came to me and he wanted to speak with me. Like I say, even as a 20-year-old man, I was 20 years old in 1988. Even as a 20-year-old, I was scared of my dad, just like I was when I was a little boy, you know. I was always kind of I don't know, I was always just scared of him, that's all. You know, because this was the man that used to knock me across rooms and knock me out and stuff, eh? So I was frightened of him, you know. Anyway, he came to me in July of 1988. We had a meeting, and the first thing he did is he apologized to me. He told me that he knew that he hadn't been the best father. He said that, you know, it wasn't that he didn't love me or anything like that. That would not be the case at all. But he didn't know how else to cope but to be the way he was, and so he sometimes was unfair with me in the way he treated me, and sometimes he was pretty brutal with me, and he apologized to me for that. And he apologized to me for being as hard on me as he was, you know. But he told me, he said, you know, you and I really aren't that much different. He said, I'm a loner. And he said, there's good reasons why I'm a loner, he said. And you're a loner too. And he said, I think you're a loner for the same reasons I'm a loner. And he said, I'm going to tell you some things that I hope will be of help to you in this life. And he said, the first thing I'm going to tell you is be very careful, you know, because he said, look, you see people and you see society as it is. And he said, you know, that is a kind of a blessing, but it's also a curse because people don't like that. He said, when you see people as they are, they don't like it. And he said, and society doesn't like that. And so he said, if you're too open about your observations, and he said, and sometimes you are, he said, I've listened to you, and sometimes you are. And he said, you hit the nail on the head most of the time. He said, most of the time what you say is right. But you piss people off. You know, people don't want to hear that. And he said, and then they punish you. And so you end up being punished for being right. And he said, I know that's not fair, but he said, that's how the world is. He said, that's just how the world works. And you've got to live in it. He said, I've had to live in it too. And he said, I've had to learn at times, you know, not to say the things I think, not to say what I observe of other people or of situations or of institutions or of society. This society in general, he said, I've had to learn to keep my opinions to myself an awful lot. And he said, the reason for that is I know that if I don't, I'll be punished. And, you know, it's hard to come back from that when you got the whole of society against you. He said, it's a tough thing to come back from. So he said, you know, not that you can't ever share your observations, but just be very careful where you share them and who you share them with. Because he said, this is a really hard world, you know, and people don't like to hear all that. It's true. It's true, he said, but that's why they don't like to hear it. People don't like to hear the truth. People go out of their way to avoid the truth, he said. And they'll go out of their way to avoid you if you're too free with the truth. So he said, there's times that you may know about something that's happening or whatever, you got to keep your mouth shut. There are times you see a situation as it is, you got to keep your mouth shut. It's frustrating. But he said, you got to do it, because if you don't, then the world will just eat you alive. And, I have found that too. Like the times that I have spoken out, a lot of the time I have been ridiculed. I've been punished in various ways. I've lost opportunities. I've I've been targeted in certain ways by authority figures and by other people in society, because I was open about speaking about things. I remember when I was driving a taxi. This was a couple of years after my dad died, but this is a good illustration of what I'm talking about and what my dad was talking about in 1988 when he came to see me. In 1990, I was driving a taxi. We were working out of a gas station in the town of Perth, Ontario, Canada. The gas station was called Mr. Gas. There's a chain of them around here, Mr. Gas stations. In fact, my boss at the time, a fellow by the name of Mark Kyle, a lot of people used to jokingly call him Mr. Gas, because he had the Mr. Gas station. Anyway, he also had a taxi company that I worked for. The taxi company was called VACAB, THECAB, VACAB. So I guess, you need a ride, call VACAB. It's the idea. Anyway, I worked for him driving a taxi cab back then. Anyway, when things were slow, it wasn't unusual that we'd just hang around at the gas station. We'd wash the cars and we'd just sit around, read the newspaper, shoot the shit, or whatever, me and the other drivers. And, generally, Mark would have some real pretty young girl working in there pumping gas, and stuff. And so we'd all hang out and shoot the shit. I wasn't much older than he'd get some pretty young high school girl. I was 22 years old, so I wasn't much older than the girls he had working there, and stuff. I was just I was old enough, but I was old enough that it wouldn't have been appropriate for me to get mixed up with them beyond, just having conversations with them and stuff. But I was, but I really wasn't that much older than them, so, we were all kind of in the same age group, all us people. We hung around there. We were all in our anywhere from 15 years old on up to about 30, Anyway, bottom line is, I don't know how we got onto it, but we got talking about various things and about just the world and how the world is and stuff. And I brought up architecture. And I brought up the lack of color, that I noticed that there was increasingly less color in the world and that architecture had gotten really boring. As I said, if you look at the older buildings, even buildings that were built in the 1930s and 40s, those are interesting buildings. But everything now is a gray or a brown cube. I said, there's no color to them. They're not interesting. They're boring, really. They're very utilitarian. They function, very functional modern architecture, but there's no form to it. It's very boring. And even like signs and whatnot, signs that you see on businesses or advertising signs and so on, they're not colorful like they used to be. And I pointed this out, and everybody in the room just laughed at me. Oh yeah, he thinks that the whole world is just gray. You're clinically depressed, Tom. You're depressed. That's what's wrong with you. Everything's gray. Everything's doom and gloom. And I was saying, well, no, that's not what I'm saying. But have you not noticed it? I said, you don't see, they're not building interesting buildings anymore. I said, they're not building, like the last interesting buildings, as far as I can tell at least, I said, were buildings that were built in the 40s, in the 40s modern style, with all the rounded corners and all that. I said, those were interesting buildings. And a lot of them were stuccoed up, and they'd be, like a blue color or a pink color or a green color or whatever. And they were just really interesting to look at. I said, those were the last, though, of the really interesting looking buildings. Well, they laughed at me anyway. But see, when they laughed at me, the conversation I'd had with my dad a couple of years ago well, a couple of years ago back then, came back to me. And I thought, this is what he was talking about, you know. But the funny thing is, now there are YouTube videos on that very subject and how architecture is used to either inspire or to suppress. And that architecture from the 1950s on, the 1950s, they started with what's called brutalist architecture. And from the brutalist movement on, architecture has been used to more suppress creativity, stifle creativity. And, you know, it's been used to de-inspire as opposed to inspire. That's what I was driving at back in 1990. But of course, there was no internet, there was no YouTube or anything back then. And I was one young man in a room full of people who were just having a great old laugh at my expense because I had said this. And some of them might have even agreed with me secretly, but they knew enough not to say anything if they did. And they just joined the crowd in laughing at me, you know, if there was anybody there who saw what I was talking about. They certainly didn't say it if they saw it. They were too busy laughing at me for saying it. But anyway, bottom line is, I remember my dad telling me all that, and he told me not to make the mistakes that he had made in life and so on. And then, of course, a couple of months later, he was gone. So I know now, looking back, why that conversation took place, you know. But the bottom line is this, you know, he never lived long enough to see the change. He didn't live long enough to see people begin to talk about these things openly. I remember when I was a kid, just by comments he said, I knew he saw things as they were. Like he used to laugh about people, you know, when they bless themselves with the holy water, when they go into a church or whatever, into the Catholic Church. He used to kind of laugh about that. He used to say, well, you know, really, you know, water's probably crawling with disease. He said everybody's sticking their fingers up their asses and in their ears and their noses and stuff and then sticking it into the water. You know, he said everybody and his dog has had their fingers in that water. Can you just imagine the germs, you know, in that water? You know, and stuff. I remember he used to say that. Well, he was right. There probably was a petri dish full of, probably had every disease imaginable to man was probably in that water. And I'm a believer in God, don't get me wrong, I am, but still, I can't help but to think that the observation was correct, looking back on it now. I remember him kind of laughing about sportscasters on the TV or on the radio, and you know, when these sportscasters on the news and how they do an editorial after they did the sports report, and he would say, you know, the whole sports report, they're talking about how this team trounced that team or beat that team or whipped that other team. You know, they always use these this really violent language to describe what one team did to the other. Yeah, there's, you know, such and such a team demolished such and such team in the hockey tournament or whatever. And then he said, next thing they're on there doing an editorial about how awful it is that there's so much violence in sports. You know, I remember him saying that to me when I was a kid. You know, that he, you know, so it showed that he was aware of the stupidity. Anyway, he was aware of the hypocrisy and the contradictions and all the rest of it that exist within society. But I guess he had learned not to be too open about that because, you know, you didn't know how people would be, and a lot of the time people would be nasty. And so, and I found that too. A lot of the time people could be quite nasty. They still can be too. But we're in an era now where things are starting to open up a bit. And as bad as these times are, and as painful as they are, and as frightening as they are, I think in some respects it's a good thing. I think society has needed the kick in the pants that it's gotten in the last few years to wake it up, really. I think it's a necessary process. It's a painful process, but it's a necessary process, you know. And like I say, my dad, he never lived to see it. He was gone long before that process started. I mean, in 1988, we were quite a ways off from that. And the ironic thing, too, is the internet, which was really established as a control mechanism, and is used that way to a degree by the powers that be. But the internet has also been the catalyst for that change. So that's also kind of interesting, you know, how their weapon in some respects has been turned against them. The ones who want to suppress and persecute and, you know, and oppress and so on. They thought the internet was going to be a one-sided thing, that they would use it to oppress and suppress and persecute us. But it's kind of turned on them in a way. And, you know, the funny thing is, you know, there's scripture about how no weapon formed against you shall prosper. You know, if you're doing right, if you're doing the Lord's work, no weapon formed against you shall prosper. And that's what we've seen with the internet, because the powers that be, when they introduced the internet, they intended to give us a lot of freedom on it at first, which they did, but that was just to give us enough rope to hang ourselves. And they eventually intended to pull that back, you know, and then to use the internet as a giant surveillance tool, a giant surveillance apparatus, which they have done with a great deal of success, don't get me wrong. But the internet has also been the catalyst. It's really been the thing that's brought us all together. And now where we're talking about things that we wouldn't talk about before. YouTube, now there's videos on YouTube about architecture and the changes in it. The thing that I got ridiculed and laughed out of the room for talking about in 1990, there are now experts on YouTube, people who have studied this stuff, professionals who have studied human behavior and have studied the effects of advertising on human behavior and the effects on environment, including architecture, have made videos where they've said there's a reason why architecture is now boring and uninspiring. And it's not a good reason. It's against us. That's what it is. It's to create a boring and uninspiring world, a bland world. Anyway, the bottom line is, if we're living in a bland world, we'll be bland. That's the idea. Anyway, so this thing that was intended to be a weapon to be used against us has in some ways been the catalyst for what's happening now, for this movement that's now occurring, where people are speaking out, where people are no longer afraid to say, you know what, this is bullshit. What's being done in this situation or that situation is wrong. This is an injustice. It shouldn't stand. Look at the people now with the cameras who go out and they record the police when the police are out doing the things they do. I've had a lot of people say to me, well, the police just became corrupt recently. No, there were no cameras until recently, that's all. I saw all that stuff that they're showing on the cameras. All that was going on when I was young. 40 years ago that stuff was going on, and I'm sure it was going on long before then, too. If you could go back to the 1800s, that stuff was probably going on. But, the sheriff in the local town was likely doing a lot of the same shit that you're seeing being done now in YouTube videos where the police are harassing people or bullying people or overstepping their authority, So, just there were no cameras. In the 1980s, when the police officer would haul me out of my car by my throat and beat the hell out of me on the side of the road, and then trump up some charge against me to justify having done so, there was no cameras. And of course, if I told the story, I wasn't believed. People would say, well, what did you do? You must have done something. What did you do that the officer had to do that to you? That's what you get, They wouldn't believe that it was possible for them to just do something like that, but I knew it was. And anybody else that had experienced it knew it was. But to those who hadn't experienced it, of course, we were all just criminals and deserving of whatever was done to us, and we were probably exaggerating or lying about it anyway. So, you know, now when there's proof, those same people who would say that to us back then are now saying, oh, yeah, but that's recent. That only just started recently. No, it didn't. It's been going on a long time. Anyway, the bottom line is we're now able to talk about things we couldn't talk about before. And of course, the things my dad said to me when I had that meeting with him in July of 1988 were really true at the time. And they're still true to a degree. But, thank God they're not as true as they were. We can now open our mouths and say something, and we should. The time has come to speak up. Not just to silently stand by and be steamrolled over by people who have bad intentions. And if we allow that to happen, the stakes are high. Right now, the stakes are very high because they're putting their plans in place now in a big way. They're pushing ahead with the agenda. And the agenda is an anti-human agenda. These are people who worship Lucifer. Lucifer is anti-human. Lucifer hates humanity because humanity was created in God's image. Lucifer can't stand that. And these are people who follow him. These are people who take their orders from him. He has them deceived. He's played an awful con job on those people. Anyway, my eyes are open. They have been for a long time. I've gotten into a lot of trouble over the years for that, and I still do sometimes. But I am noticing there's more and more people now who are willing to open their mouths and speak on issues that they wouldn't have spoken about a few years ago. And some of the people in the crowd that would laugh at you a few years ago, those same people might be more quick to defend you now in the same situation, because the threat isn't there like it was. Because there's safety in numbers, and there's more and more of us all the time that are noticing all this stuff and that are speaking out about it. Anyway, that's it. I just wanted to share that all with you, and we'll talk to you all later.